Hello everybody, welcome back to another video. Quickly before we get going, I do just want to let you know that this video will be covering topics such as suicide, depression, drug use, and I will also very briefly speak on miscarriages and child abuse. If any of these things make you uncomfortable or squeamish, go ahead and click off this video and stay tuned for the next one. The dead all along trope is one of the most popular twists to arise in the last century. Whether or not the twist is done with the intention of serving the plot and character development or to simply shock the audience is dependent on the angle of which the story is coming from. Two of my absolute favorite horror franchises, American Horror Story and The Haunting, have used this twist in two very different ways. American Horror Story and The Haunting of Hill House have very similar premises and series structures, in that both of them are anthologies. While American Horror Story has been running strong now for 13 years and has managed to release 12 seasons, The Haunting first released in 2018 and only has 2 installments, mostly due to creator Mike Flanagan's less is more mentality when storytelling. American Horror Story creator Ryan Murphy has taken the complete opposite approach of offering the very loud, loyal, and oftentimes rabid American Horror Story fanbase more and more each year. It's very interesting to see the different approaches that these two creators have, despite following a very similar model of creating. When researching for this video, I couldn't exactly find when the first example of this trope was used, leading me to believe that the trope has been around for quite a long time. Films like 1989's Beetlejuice, 1999's The Sixth Sense, and 2001's The Others all use the twist differently and for different reasons. In Beetlejuice, the twist happens almost immediately after the Maitlands are involved in a car crash. They return to their house where they find the handbook on the recently deceased, which clues them in on the fact that they are dead. All of this happens relatively early on in the script and is the inciting incident of the film. In The Sixth Sense, it isn't until toward the end of the film when Bruce Willis's character Malcolm finds out he's dead. Malcolm, a psychologist, starts seeing a boy named Cole who claims to see dead people. After the film reaches its climax, Malcolm eventually sort of puts the pieces together that he himself is one of the dead people that Cole sees. In 2001's The Others, we have yet another example of the characters finding out that they are dead very late into the script. The film follows a family of 3 led by Nicole Kidman's Grace, living in a mansion in 1945. Grace hires 3 servants who help them with their housework, and throughout the film, a lot of sketchy shit happens. Grace claims that her 2 young children cannot be exposed to natural light because they have a rare skin condition that will kill them if they go outside. Eventually, Grace finds out that these 3 servants took down all the curtains and tried to expose her children to sunlight. An important thing to note is that these children claim that their mother went mad one night and has been an emotional wreck ever since. By the end of the film, it is revealed that the 3 interlopers, cosplaying as servants, are ghosts when Grace finds a photograph of them from half a century before. Grace panics as these 3 interlopers approach her children before yelling for them to go upstairs and hide. Eventually, the servants take the children upstairs, and more ghosts start showing their faces to them. Grace arrives on the scene and sees them talking to her children before it's revealed in a shocking twist that she and her children themselves are ghosts as well. The night that she, quote, went mad was the night that she killed her children and then shot herself in the head. Out of these 3 examples that I just mentioned, this one definitely has to be my absolute favorite because I didn't see this twist coming and it hadn't been spoiled to me like the twists in Beetlejuice and The Sixth Sense. American Horror Story and Hill House take 2 completely different approaches to this twist. In the case of American Horror Story, it's used to shock and surprise the audience, whereas in Hill House, only half of the information is revealed to us in the first episode, while the rest of it comes much later on. In the American Horror Story pilot, we are introduced to the Harmon family, who move into a 90-year-old house that the locals call the murder house. Violet Harmon, the typical moody teenager of the family, remains wary about the house, despite being the one to ultimately agree to buy it. While her parents are busy with their tumultuous relationship amid recent cheating and miscarriages, Violet attends her first days of school, getting bullied by her classmates. She's a teenage girl from Boston who has now moved to LA, where people noticeably treat her much differently. One day, she meets her father's patient named Tate, who just is seemingly always around the house for some reason. He sneaks into Violet's room and they hang out with each other after all of his sessions with Ben. These two are like the typical Tumblr era, we're not like other couples relationship. The kind of people you meet in high school who are usually sitting on each other's lap instead of next to each other at the lunch table, staring into each other's eyes while feeding each other food, all the while listening to their favorite indie band. You know the type. Much like in many other ghost stories where the child sees the heart of the house, Violet is the one to realize that she's living in a haunted house first. On Halloween night, Violet and her boyfriend Tate are chased through the streets by some former classmates of his. The kids claim they're following them to get some answers and possibly some revenge. The kids allude to a specific situation where Tate might have caused them a lot of pain.
I should be 34 years old and married. Baby.
I don't know you. I'm sorry. I don't know you.
But Tate claims he has absolutely no recollection of even knowing them. The kids give up after a while and walk away from the couple. Violet looks up their names in the following episode, and what she finds comes as a complete shock to her. The kids that followed her and her boyfriend around the last episode are dead. And the thing that her boyfriend Tate did to them to piss them off is he killed them 17 years prior. Despite looking 17 himself, it's here where Violet learns that her boyfriend Tate is also dead and has been for 17 years. This leads Violet on a downward spiral. She seeks answers, so she turns to the school librarian. The librarian says he almost didn't survive himself due to the bullet's proximity to his spine, stating that had it been an inch closer, he would have died. Despite Violet just wanting to learn about this incident earnestly, the librarian gives her almost nothing besides his statement that Tate just snapped one day. So a bit later on, she meets with her frenemy Leah, who gives her some painkillers before returning home and attempting to kill herself by downing a handful of them. This leads Tate to show himself to her for the first time since Halloween in order to save her from overdosing. By episode 10, her boyfriend believes that Ben is trying to keep them apart. So in an effort to essentially stop him from doing that, Tate tries to convince Violet to join him in a suicide pact. Violet feels as though this is a very tricky situation, so she pretends to be okay with it, but ultimately runs downstairs yelling for help. When Tate chases her, she runs out of the house before returning through the other door. Confused, she attempts to do it again. She begs for help from people across the street who completely ignore her. Tate tries to calm her down, eventually taking her down into the crawl space where he shows her her own dead body. This reveals to us as an audience and to Violet herself that in episode 6, she did not survive the overdose. Violet has been a ghost roaming the halls of her house ever since. Violet eventually finds out that Tate R-worded her mother, and that's when she eventually calls it quits with him for good, at least until Apocalypse. The Haunting of Hill House is a pretty massive story that almost entirely revolves around its characters and their relationships with each other. Similar to American Horror Story Murder House in the sense that if you were to remove all of the character moments and traits from the plot, all you'd be left with is a typical haunted house story, a simple set of jump scares and twists with absolutely no weight. Both of these stories have this in common, however, Hill House is 10 times as effective at understanding and portraying its characters because of how the story itself is laid out. Murder House only has a handful of flashbacks in its season, and while there are certainly enough for us to understand exactly why the characters are the way they are, Hill House just does this 10 times better. The season is split into two main storylines, one in the 80s and one in 2018, with the screen time between both of these storylines being divided evenly. We learn about each of the characters from two completely different times in their lives, childhood and adulthood. This allows us as an audience to have such a deep understanding of who these people are at their core. Each of the first 5 episodes in Hill House focuses on a different one of the Crane siblings. They tell us about who they are from that character's point of view. For example, in the first episode, and in ones that follow, the audience learns that the second youngest child named Luke grew up to be a drug addict that lies, steals, and betrays his family on multiple occasions. However, it isn't until the 4th episode where we truly get into Luke's head and learn about the trauma he sustained as a child. On top of all of that, his addiction is viewed by his siblings as such a liability and a moral failing on Luke's part. This episode seeks to explain and redeem and sort of highlight that it's not Luke's fault that he's an addict. Up until this point in episode 4, Luke isn't shown too often in the present day plots because he's the least close geography-wise to his siblings, as he's in rehab when the show begins. Instead, the show gives us all of Luke's development here in episode 4. We learn that he's constantly having to be reminded of a particular encounter he had with a ghost as a kid. We also learn that his best friend and addict Joey runs away from rehab in this episode, and when he finds her, he promises to get her help. Except all of the shelters and rehab centers in their area are full, so Luke decides to ask around for a bed, eventually making his way to his brother Steve's house to ask for money for a paid shelter. However, Steven isn't home, so Luke enters the apartment himself to steal it. Steve then arrives and sees Luke stealing from him, instead offering him cash because he assumes Luke is just running off to buy drugs. We get this exact same scene in episode 1, but with none of the setup I just mentioned. It's just presented to us as Luke breaking into Steve's apartment to steal from him so he can buy drugs. This kind of bait and switch style of storytelling is riddled throughout Hill House. Also in episode 1, we are introduced to Eleanor Crane, aka Nellie or Nell. Nell is the youngest Crane sibling, and as a child she was completely traumatized by a ghost she refers to as the Bent Neck Lady. More on her later. In the episode, she calls her older brother Steve from a hotel room and he completely ignores the call. She clearly is in some sort of distress, but we don't see why. We see her older sister Shirley's phone buzz as well, again followed by another rejection. She eventually calls her dad, Hugh, who actually picks up this time. Nellie tells her dad that the Bent Neck Lady is back. That's interesting. I wonder if that'll mean anything later. Nellie tells her dad that she's at home in bed before the camera reveals to us that she's actually not. She has in fact returned to the now abandoned Hill House from her childhood. Throughout the rest of the episode, we see Nellie dancing alone in a dimly lit, uninviting hallway. Let's catch back up with Steven for a second. At the beginning of the episode, we learn that despite being some sort of paranormal investigator and author, Steven has never actually seen a ghost himself. He was seemingly the least affected out of his severely traumatized younger siblings and has taken to profiting off of their traumas by writing books about their lives. Steven believes that what ultimately caused his mother to kill herself and what has eaten away at his brother Luke's life, and the reason why his younger sisters Shirley, Theo, and Nellie never quite dealt with their problems is all due to mental illness. This is something that him and his siblings and his father all completely disagree on. The younger siblings who actually saw paranormal events as kids feel completely invalidated by Steve, who writes all of their problems off as crazy, while profiting off of their quote-unquote delusional experiences. Steve is one complicated character, and I cannot go into all of his specific shit in this video, but that's basically the gist of what his character is. He's just a big hypocrite. Shortly after paying his brother off, Steve enters his apartment, and Nell is just there, standing in complete darkness. He asks her why she let their brother Luke in, to which Nellie refuses to answer. Steve then gets a call from his father, who informs him that his sister Nell was found dead in their old house earlier that day.
She's dead. She's dead.
Steven, who is looking right at Nellie during this conversation, has now seen his very first ghost. This is one of the most horrifying and disturbing scenes I've ever watched from a TV show. Like, it had me gagged, and it had me gooped. I don't know if it's the best example of the dead all along trope, but because of how the reveal is done, it might be my absolute favorite. Nellie is only dead for like half the episode before the audience and Steve find this out. Compared to Violet, who was dead for 4 episodes before we realized it, that's not a lot of time. The thing that Hill House doesn't tell us is how and why she died. Violet's overdose is built up for an entire episode. She starts slipping further and further and begins seeking an escape upon hearing about her boyfriend's past. We are shown Violet's death in episode 6, but it's presented to us as her surviving thanks to Tate, when in reality, her spirit is just passing on to the other side. When Violet finds her body in the crawl space, we find her body in the crawl space. We don't need any more context as to why and how she died, because we already saw all of that in the lead up to her death in episode 6. In Nellie's case, however, we didn't get to see a body. She arrives at the old house, and the next thing we know, Hugh is telling Stephen that she's dead. This, paired with the haunting performance by Victoria Pedretti, leads us as an audience to fully believe Nell is dead, even though we're served no evidence other than Hugh's word and whatever this guttural scream cry is. And so this brings us to the bent neck lady. Much like her twin Luke, Nellie was absolutely traumatized while living in Hill House. In the past, Nellie is frequently shown waking up to a dark silhouette of a woman dressed in a nightgown with her neck bent to a complete 90 degrees, just staring at her. We learn that throughout the years, this vision of a tall, faceless woman never fully went away, and in fact, it got worse. Instead of simply appearing to Nell, the ghost started coming to her during actual sleep paralysis, where she would be absolutely trapped. Nellie eventually marries her sleep technician, who tries his best to help her through these difficult episodes. While her therapist and husband believe that she has unprocessed trauma from her childhood and that might be what's causing these visions, Nellie believes that this is a genuine evil spirit haunting her, or perhaps her deceased mother watching over her in her sleep. After her husband dies of an aneurysm whilst she's having one of these episodes, by the way, Nell officially starts going off the deep end.
He was dead. He was dead and she was back.
How long had it been? Since you'd seen her, I mean.
It's been almost 2 years. I actually hadn't seen her since Arthur and I met.
It was a random tragic event.
I know it looked like an aneurysm.
It's perfectly normal to want to find something to blame.
I know what's to blame.
Hill House.
Hill House.
Her therapist gives her some of the worst advice I've ever heard from a TV show therapist. He says to return to the haunted place from her childhood in order to make peace with all of her trauma. So Nellie does this and is sort of welcomed by the house. She begins seeing younger versions of herself and her siblings playing in the foyer. Her mother walks in and Nellie ultimately falls for the house's deception. The house dresses her up and has her relive real moments from her wedding in an attempt to ease her into staying there. Nellie finally feels comfort and stability for the first time in years thanks to the house's manipulations. She's no longer ignored and silenced by her other siblings. Now she's being embraced and celebrated by them. The house basically gives Nellie the big happy family she's always wanted, before it strips it all away from her. Liv, her mother, as mentioned before, died in the house when Nell was only 6. Shortly thereafter, the children were taken from their father and lived with their Aunt Janet until they were old enough to live on their own, resulting in a whole slew of unprocessed trauma. I could literally make a video on each character. It's so bad for all of them. Liv leads Nellie upstairs and gives her a necklace to wear, the same one she told her that she'd give to her once she was old enough. However, this is another facade by the house. Nellie quickly realizes that the necklace is a noose. And just like that, Liv kisses her daughter on the forehead and pushes her to hang herself. Nellie is genuinely seeing the ghost of her mother in this moment, but Liv is not the same woman that she was when she moved into the house. This house corrupts and manipulates and overtakes a person's psyche. When Nellie falls and begins hanging there, she sees her life flash before her eyes, only from the perspective of the bent neck lady. In fact, Nellie is the bent neck lady. All of those sleepless nights that Nellie had as a kid were literally her seeing her own death. The house sort of planted this seed in Nellie's head as a kid. We finally get the why and the how surrounding Nellie's death. It wasn't a suicide. It was her mother, and by default, the house. Despite using two completely different approaches to this trope, both American Horror Story and The Haunting of Hill House are incredibly successful in creating very unsettling reveals that have major ramifications for the rest of their respective seasons. Much like the rest of the show's loud and in-your-face approach to storytelling, the twist in American Horror Story serves as pure shock value to generate as much excitement and enthusiasm from the American Horror Story fans. The Haunting of Hill House's take on the twist, however, completely relies on setup and payoff during Nellie's arc throughout the season. I would personally love to make a full series retrospective on The Haunting of Hill House, and maybe even its successor, The Haunting of Bly Manor, because both are absolutely fantastic, so maybe I'll save that for another day. For now, I hope you enjoyed this small look into two of my favorite shows and one of my favorite tropes. And as always, happy Halloween.